Alright, Flight Boss, bitch, you know, for sure. You're not listening to the Mind of an Terry's Moon. Flight Boss, the Archangel Uriel. And I'm in the care I gotta do these motherfucking responsibilities. And right now, I want to talk about for any confusion anybody have. Because, you know, now look, when I do people astro chart, I also do your house, your regular houses also. I just have a separate chart where I could break down your original houses. So in my last video that I just put up, it was actually breaking down the original house system, but how I compare it to the regular houses that you have. So a few people left me a message, you know, wanting me to combine the two. Because, you know, like, I can understand where people may be like, okay, it makes sense, but how do we connect it to, how did we come to the conclusion of what the internet is saying my houses is? You know what I'm saying? Which I also tell you that also. I got multiple ways of getting there. Now, for the most part, now I'm going to go towards the internet way of how I get there. And I'm going to basically use myself for an example. Now look, I was born in Aries season. So the sun is in Aries, period. When we talk about the stars, the stars in the space that we are in. At that time of the year, Aries season, the sun is there. That's where the sun is at. You know what I'm saying? So when I started talking about, people start to confuse the houses with the name, I start to get into conversations about how we came up with the houses and the names in general. But this video is more surface level so you can understand how they calculate it on the computer. You know what I'm saying? Now, for the most part, like I said, my sun is in Aries, so which means my sun is in the Aries season. So now we're talking about a higher clock and a lower clock now. You can call it Western, Eastern, however you want to call it. Now, for the most part, by my sun being in Aries, that made my sun sign Aries. Now, I was born at 2:44 p.m. in the afternoon. So, for the most part, when the sun is in Aries, that means when the sun is rising in the morning from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m., that backdrop from a smaller clock, from our perspective, will be the first house. So, for an example, now, my sun was rising in the 5th house. So that is my rising, because I was born at 2:44 p.m. of the day. So from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. will be 5th house energy of the day. But there's going you see what I'm saying? That's 5th house energy of the day. So since when I was born, my sun was rising in the 5th house energy, the 5th house energy becomes my first house. See what I'm saying? That when the sun was rising, if you was born on a time wherever the sun was rising, that becomes your rising sign, the ascendant sign. So now, since my sun was rising in the 5th house area, right, the sign that was in the 5th house at the time was Leo, right? Now, since my sun was rising there, how the internet calculates your house, that becomes your first house. See what I'm saying? So the 5th house becomes your first house, but the internet are calculated as it being your first house. So they take the wheel and bring it back. So the 5th house becomes my first house. And then we want to call the 5th house, at that time it was Leo there. So this means I have a Leo ascendant, because the sun was rising in the 5th house, and at the time Leo was in the 5th house. So the sun was rising in those stars when I was born. Now the 5th house becomes my first house. So the clock, take the 5th house, turn it to the first house. So my first house, computer wise, will be Leo, because Leo was in that 5th house at the time when I was born. So that becomes my first house. So even computers get what I'm saying. They just throw you off a little bit. So boom, that becomes my first house, which is Leo. So since we're in Aries season, right, if Leo becomes the first house, then Aries has no choice but to be 9 houses away. Because, for an example, if Leo becomes, because this is where the confusion comes from, calling the signs the name. But for the most part, it's really you're really supposed to say, well, I'm really supposed to say the 5th house became my first house. But since we calling the sign I was there at the time, then I'm going to just have to say Leo is my first house. You see what I'm saying? So now that becomes my first house. It takes 9 houses to get to Aries. Because, for an example, you got Leo, my first house. Virgo will be my second house. Libra will be my 3rd house. Scorpio will be my 4th house. Sagittarius will be my 5th house. Capricorn will be my 6th house. Aquarius will be my 7th house. 8th house will be Pisces. 9th house will be Aries. So when they calculate my chart, since we was in Aries season when I was born, the sun will appear to be on the calculations of the 9th house. You see what I'm saying? From my perspective. See, from my perspective. See, when I was explaining it in my last video, I'm trying to explain it from everybody's perspective and how astrologers even came up with the science in general. But when you get your chart done and when you calculate it on astrology, now it's from your perspective. This is why I'm calling the Palladius, whatever charts that they call it, those calculations, that's why I like to call them, those are like angles. So those are important also because they are like angles just like your alignments or your other planetary alignments. But your original house placement and the original house system, the computer, they go by the actual calculations, but they don't go by the actual system. You see what I'm saying? So they calculate the same way, but they don't engineer it in the same system. So for the most part, let's say like my son was rising in the 5th house area of the day when I was born, which is 2:44 p.m. So that will become my first house, but I was started there. My first house is the 5th house, and I was started from the 5th house scenario. So the 5th house becomes my first house, and then the 6th house becomes my second house. See, they don't go by the system like that. When you get it by the computer, they basically go back to calling it the signs. You know what I'm saying? So for the most part, like my sun was rising in the 5th house area when I was born, which is 2:44 p.m. And since Leo was residing in that aspect at the time, which is the 5th house, then that means I'm a Leo ascendant. So then they write when they say, boom, that's your first house. But then where they fuck up at is saying that's your first house. You get what I'm saying? So now they take the clock back. They move the clock themselves. And now your first house is Leo. So it's like they do it the other way around. So now it's like your first house is Leo. So the way you act out first house energy is in a Leo way. Well, really it's supposed to be the other round. The way you act out that energy is in a 5th house way. You see what I'm saying? The way you act out the second house is in a 6th house way, if you have my same chart. So you know, that's just basically understanding the houses and how to understand the possessions, and it's a higher clock and a lower clock, basically. So for an example, so say you are a Taurus and you was born in the Taurus season, right? So at that time from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. Taurus is going to be rising. So let's say if say if I was born, well, let's just say you was born a Taurus, right? And you was born between 12 p.m. to 2 p.m., right? That would be the 4th house. But the 4th house would no longer be Scorpio. The 4th house would be Gemini. You see what I'm saying? The 4th house, no, not Gemini, but my bad, Leo. The 4th house becomes Leo. See, because they call it the signs, so they move it back. So when the sun go into Taurus season, the first house, which is 6 a.m. to 8 a.m., become Taurus. So the second house becomes Gemini. The 3rd house becomes Cancer. The 4th house becomes Leo. You see what I'm saying? Now, if you was born in Gemini season, right? Then from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m., then Gemini will be the ascendant at that time. You see what I'm saying? So the first house would be Gemini. The second house will be Cancer. Your third house will be Leo. Your 4th house will be Virgo. Your 5th house will be Libra. You see what I'm saying? If you was born in Cancer season, then from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. in the morning, that would be Cancer ascendant. You see what I'm saying? So the first house at that time will be Cancer. The second house at that time will be motherfucking Leo. Yeah, the 3rd house at that time will be Virgo. You see what I'm saying? And so on and so on and so forth. Now you got a few placements that may interchange, because we know constellations expand between 40 degrees to 30 degrees sometimes. So sometimes we just be trying to calculate it based upon our spaces. But let's say for the most part, your house start at a very early degree of a house, and it depends on what sign, what constellation is in that house at the time. You know why? Because depending on the sign in the house, when your sun is rising in a Pacific sign, if it's rising, or a Pacific house, if it's rising at a very early degree, then depending on that sign, that house may cover the whole, the sign may cover the whole 30 degrees of that house and the next house and a little bit of the next house. You see what I'm saying? So you'll have two houses sharing the same energy. You get what I'm saying? So it's like it's all about our space perspective. And then we got that information where the internet calculated that right, because we got that information by understanding that the stars are actually moving. And the stars are, and constellations are actually bigger than other constellations. You see what I'm saying? So it goes deep into a lot of different scenarios, but you know, yeah, that's basically how how you conflate it to how we see it now. But it's still the same time, still the same reference. It's just many different ways how to get there. My last video is like almost the most original way to get there, but then this right here is like the calculated way to get there. It's just understanding the different wheels and understanding the different clocks. But fight boss, bitch, goddamn air.